στην έκθεση Vrysaki, η αναβίωση μιας γειτονιάς, η οποία παρουσιάζεται στην Τέρεγα Μακριάνη μέχρι τις 17 Νοεμβρίου. Καλωσορίζω επίσης όσους από εσάς μας παρακολουθείτε διαδικτυακά. Ο ομιλητής μας απόψε είναι ο διακεκριμένος Michael Herzfeld, ομότιμος καθηγητής κοινωνικών επιστημών Ernest E. Monrad του Πανεπιστημίου Harvard και κορυφαίος κοινωνικός ανθρωπολόγος της εποχής μας. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, and students. I am Bonna Westcote, Director of the American School of Classical Studies here in Athens, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight for our final and capstone lecture associated with the exhibition Vrysaki, The Revival of a Neighborhood, which is on view in the Makriani Swing until November 17th. I also welcome those of you who are following us online. Now, our speaker this evening is the distinguished Michael Herzfeld, Ernst E. Monrad Professor of Social Sciences Emeritus at Harvard University and a leading social anthropologist of our time. Michael Herzfeld is an expert in social theory, history of anthropology, social poetics, and the politics of history. His research encompasses a broad cultural horizon from Greece and Italy to Thailand, and he works across these cultures to better understand the highly complex dynamics that shape identity construction in a world of uneven political, economic, and social relations. The exhibition Vrysaki, The Revival of a Neighborhood, draws on the archives of the Agora excavations and of the American School to recover something of the neighborhood and community that once stood over the ruins of the ancient Agora of Athens, the second most visited archaeological site in Greece. We all know that archaeology is a physically destructive science. The costs can be human and communal as well as material. Michael Herzfeld offers a highly compelling analysis of the stakes and the pressures. Please join me in welcoming him to speak on Monumentality against Domesticity, the Vrysaki story, and the global hierarchy, of heritage value. Michael.
Good evening. Kalispera. I hope I'm not expected to do the whole thing in a bilingual format as well. It is tempting, but we will be here a very long time, and I don't think you would really want to put up with my voice that long. So I have a paper here that I'm going to be reading, which is not my usual modus operandi, because it's quite a complex story, and I want to try to bring you along with that story as carefully as I can. So I want to say, though, that I have been explicitly asked to place the Vrysaki story in a larger context, and so I want to do that in three dimensions. First of all, what I call the crypto-colonial construction of modern Greek identity. Second, the valuation of historic remains of various periods. And thirdly, the global problem of housing and attachment to place. These three generic contexts require some explanation. I speak not, of course, as an archaeologist, but as a social anthropologist, and I feel that my discipline is best characterized by the productive tension between an extreme focus on detail and a concern with the big picture at the same time. And social anthropology is by definition a comparative discipline, but people are often puzzled by the extent to which it focuses on very tiny details. Hopefully this talk will provide some example of the way we operate. It is in any case a great honor to address this audience about a topic that has been, of course, wonderfully exposed over the past months by this magnificent exhibition and by the publication of Sylvie Dumont's book on Vrysaki. So let me say right away that book represents, if not in the usual literal sense, itself a kind of archaeology, perhaps in the sense intended by Michel Foucault. It's an excavation of an archive, but an archive constructed by archaeologists who consciously or otherwise clearly felt the inconsistency that would have characterized altogether a massive excavation on which the most recent period had totally disappeared. So I just want to make sure I've got this right, so we can begin with the slides. And there is the book itself, and many of you have already seen it, I think. Now, such projects of cleaning away awkward memories occur. This is not what we're talking about here, but we do know that, for example, as Yanis Kamilakis and Raphael Greenberg showed for Greece and Israel, respectively, such things have happened in the past for very obvious political reasons. And what I have observed in Thailand, just to take you a little further afield, is a very similar process, less through the destruction of layers as through the absorption of monuments into new stories, because the Thais don't like confrontation. So instead of destroying things, they simply adapt them to new stories. And I call that the airbrushing of history. And I discussed that at some length in comparison with some Greek cases in the book Subversive Archaism, came out a couple of years ago. The creation and preservation of the Vrysaki archive is itself a major achievement of scholarship, and one that attests to a powerful ethical commitment, regardless of what one might think, and I certainly do think, of the larger project of Western European colonialism, in which it is historically, and therefore unavoidably, embedded. To some extent, in a lecture like this, it would be virtually impossible to avoid simplifying the Vrysaki story. That's why I've just pointed out the ethical complexities of that story. My entire argument tonight is about nuance, about the importance of insisting, even militantly, on the importance of understanding the major actors' deeds in the context of the prevailing ideologies and identities in which they were caught. I can't begin to reproduce the magnificently wide-reaching but also fine-grained history given us by Sylvie Dumont, and I certainly can't do it in the context of a single lecture, but I can lean on her extraordinarily rich scholarship and suggest connections that she, reasonably enough, chose not to consider appropriate topics for the immediate goals of her book. So my goal tonight is, as I've described it, and I hope it will contribute to our understanding of the role of Western European and North American involvement in Greek cultural politics, and to a commitment to nuance rather than polemics when facing the sometimes harsh realities and inevitable conflicts that clashes of dissonant geopolitical interests inevitably produce. Our goals are thus significantly different, but I would like to believe mutually complementary in significant ways, as you can certainly discern in a very generous reaction to my urging that she write a reflexive epilogue to the book, which is also, I think, a really serious enrichment of what she did. But let me be very clear on one central point. I am not interested in pointing a finger of blame and contempt at any institution, let alone the one that's hosting us here tonight. And I do understand the rules of philoxenia. But it's not just respect for those rules that induces in me a desire for balance and nuance. It is a conviction that for far too long we've been prey to polarized epistemologies as well as politics, recently demonstrated. But in epistemology, positivism and objectivism versus constructivism and postmodernism, and then politically conservatism versus communism, the irresponsible avant-garde and the repressive establishment, and so on. I do intend to be militant, but I'm going to be militant in defense of what I call the militant middle ground, which might sound like a contradiction, but I love contradictions. The hardest place of all, in fact, to establish and maintain any kind of militancy. Why is this important? Because, as Sylvie Dumont shows through her meticulous documentation, good intentions sometimes collide with each other, but we need to recognize them as good intentions. There were important reasons for excavating the Agora, not all of them political or to do with shoring up the Greek state's claims to high antiquity. There were and are important reasons to lament the disappearance of the Vrysaki neighborhood, although it should be said immediately that it is much to the credit of the Greek and American archaeologists that the former encouraged and the latter carried out such a careful documentation of what was being destroyed so as to make Sylvie Dumont's remarkable book possible and for me to be discussing these complexities today. So this is not a morality tale. What I'm interested in is asking some pertinent questions. For example, why, other than for the usual archaeological concerns and reasons, was the Agora so important? What exclusions and inclusions did the cultural politics of the time generate, and how do they affect what the world, especially tourists and visiting dignitaries, that's often important, see today? So let me first begin with a few words about my conceptual framework. First, crypto-colonialism and modern Greek identity. I might say that the comparisons that I've made between Greece on the one hand and Thailand, Iran, Turkey, etc., have caused some discomfort, and that discomfort I will address in a moment. While official Greek historiography mistakenly insists on calling the Ottoman period a Turkokratia, when we all know that Greek bureaucrats in fact played a very large role in it, I would argue that Greece emerged from the ruins of the Ottoman Empire already shackled to a different subjugation, or ipodoulousi. It's never called ipodoulousi in official sources, of course, but that is the ipodoulousi by the Western powers. There's a reason for this local silence, which is, however, now weakening at a fairly rapid pace, I think. Socially conservative elements in Greek society resent any suggestion that Greece has been a victim of the machinations of colonial powers, but there is good reason to believe that this is because their and their immediate associates' complicity in that phenomenon has today become an embarrassment. That resentment has occasionally been used in response to my coinage of the term crypto-colonialism, application of it to the Greek situation. I define it as the most dishonest form of colonialism, in which various forms of political control over a country, enabled by a cultural and linguistic elite, masquerade as full independence or complete independence, which is probably an impossibility for any country. Now, the American School of Classical Studies at Athens' relationship and that of the British School at Athens next door to the crypto-colonial project is a complex one and can't be addressed in terms of the usual morality play. That's another reason for avoiding that kind of approach. The school's long-term involvement, along with the BSA, in the battle against the Nazi occupation of Greece has been extensively documented, particularly in the well-known book by Susan Hugh Allen. Sorry, going the wrong way. Story of my life. There we go. It's important to remember at all times that our own understanding of that period is colored by the present-day politics of post-coloniality and its various associated intellectual concerns. So, we have to realize that people went into this with the best of intentions, and we probably should be very grateful that they did it, in fact. But that didn't eradicate the elements of Nazism from Greek society, as we all know, and so the British also bear a considerable part of the blame, I think, for the sharp turn to the right, which resulted, among other things, in the Colonel's regime of 1967 to 74. Another dimension in the long history of property exploitation in Athens and elsewhere. Athens is, as the architectural historian Ioanna Theocharopoulou has pointed out in her, get this right, yes, good, in her recent book, now the subject also of a film with the same title, a city whose social fabric was built, in a more literal sense, by builders. That is to say, the polykatikia is a testament not only to the post-World War II reconstruction, but also to the city's determination to remain a place of sociality. Theocharopoulou actually says at one point that Athens doesn't look beautiful by the conventional aesthetic standards, its beauty comes from its sociability. And I think that's something that does deserve thinking about, and she points out that it is the fact that the polykateikia rarely goes above 6 stories that means that the principle of eyes on the street and social interaction between street and home is much more intense than in any other large city in Europe. Now that sociality is under threat by the newest incarnation of extractive ideology, the neoliberal economic regime that allows a new destruction of social life. And we see that particularly in the spread of Airbnb in Athens, which has been the topic of a brilliant and well-reasoned polemic by Efthymios Papadakis. And it has put a lot of middle-class Greeks who might have been very much in favor of the old way of doing things very much in a bad position because they can't afford to live in the areas where it used to be taken for granted that any reasonably well-to-do or even not so well-to-do Athenian could set up house. Now, some might argue that this is progress and as such inevitable. We hear those kinds of arguments all the time. Even well-intentioned scholars have been known to take that position, and it's obvious why building construction contractors would do so. I would counter all these claims in the name of development or progress by suggesting that such, something I want to call vicarious fatalism, or a surrender to the crescendo of economic inequality, is actually a discursive device through which the speculators force the issue upon a reluctant population. Just as very often people used to describe the Greeks as fatalists in general as a way of explaining why the West kept pushing the Greek nation and the Greek nation state to do certain things, so this current way of saying that it's inevitable that the housing market will be inflated, will become expensive, and this is a mark of economic progress. This is, in more technical terms, a performative utterance. It's a way of, as Douglas Holmes, in a wonderful book called Economy of Words, points out, the way the central banks in Europe predicted what was going to happen and therefore made it happen. And the crisis in Greece was one part of that. But there were many other similar moments. And I think that what we see in the case of the housing crisis is, again, an example of a performative utterance becoming inevitably true. It creates its own truth. And so in his magisterial preface to the Dumont volume, Kostis Kourelis invokes Roland Barthes to liken archaeology to the layered resurrection of the past. And I want to quote that passage. Archaeology engages in similar death rituals, resurrecting one layer at a time and then killing it again to reveal what is below in reverse sequence to historical time. As in the Roman Forum, the excavations in the Athenian Agora create a wound in contemporary time to reveal the dead past, a wound that involves unprecedented magnitudes of demolition, displacement, and disruption, unquote. Now, Mortimer Wheeler had said years before that all excavation is, in fact, an act of destruction, but it's also an act of recording, and that's precisely the way, I think, in which the school undertook the task of recording the disappearing modern part of the city, or not so modern, but at least not ancient part of the city. Now, the comparison with the Roman Forum, I think, is a different kind of a different kettle of fish. But what I really want to say here, once again, is we're looking at performative utterances in action. People say, this is what has to happen, and it happens. Or as Laurie Kane Hart says, invoking the title of a famous essay by J.L. Austin, How to Do Things with Words, she has an article entitled How to Do Things with Things, and is looking specifically at how architectural rituals actually bring about changes in meaning. Now, if you see those rituals being managed by big business, then you can begin to understand that what happened to Vrysaki wasn't exactly in the same line of events as the recent development of property speculation in Athens, but there is a larger picture of which they both form a part, and it's useful, I think, to think of them together. Now, following Cordelis' comment, I briefly mentioned Rome again, and I want to acknowledge the parallel to which he was pointing. At this point, however, it seems also relevant to invoke an important difference between Athens and Rome. So, Rome, sorry, I'm doing the same thing. Rome is, as you see, a sort of palimpsest. In my ethnography of Rome, I call it a promiscuous stratigraphy. You see every period mixed up with every other period. There are a lot of spolia of various types, and the city continues to live off its antiquity. And you see how this happens. Here we have an 18th century house on the left, the 1st century wall built by Augustus, and then behind it the part of the Roman Forum that was put up probably in the 3rd century, and so on and so forth. And a bit further behind these buildings, you can see the 6th century palace of Maxentius, and so on and so forth. The church, of Maxentius, and so on. What we see here is something that I think will help us get a better grip on the Vrysaki story as soon as we compare the situation in Rome with that of Athens, where you can look from almost any high point towards the Acropolis, and this is what you see. You see certain monuments, a few of them, very few relative to Rome, marked out as special spaces, but in between you see, this is a rather foggy photograph, I'm sorry to say, but you see modernity, occasionally a little bit of Byzantine, a church or something, but basically this visually reconstructs the ideology that modern Greece is not just the continuation, but essentially the same thing as its ancient forebears, and I think that's an important difference. And items of personal attachment to place do not play a part in that story at all. So when the people from Vrysaki left, we don't know whether they took the keys with them, for example, as many people did in displacements from northern Cyprus and more recently also from Palestine, or whether they had other rituals through which they tried to reestablish their connection with a place that no longer existed. But this is the biggest kind of performative utterance of all, because it really wipes out any sense of the continuity that crosses between different periods. Athenians really do not get that much of a sense of that kind of continuity. Moreover, a quick glance from any high point toward the Acropolis reveals this cultural ideology with some clarity. The difference is limned in visual terms of Vista Polykatikias, the occasional Byzantine church, and as I say, and the Byzantine elements were seen by the mid-19th century historians like Paparigopoulos and Zambelius as the link between antiquity and the present day, and why not? That's not an unreasonable position to take, but that probably also explains to some extent how some of the traces of the Byzantine presence also survived in the visual, in the vista that we see here. Now, there are also two important additional differences between the two cities, Rome and Athens, that should concern us. In Rome, the gaping wound created by Mussolini's Caesarist obsessions and the consequent sventramento, as he called it, the disemboweling of entire neighborhoods, notably the now completely obliterated neighborhood of Marforio. In fact, if you ask anyone in Rome today, where's Marforio, they mostly don't know. It doesn't exist anymore. But that was less about excavation and much more about self-display. Notably, the construction of the Via dei Fori Imperiali was designed to allow Mussolini himself, and of course his military might, to parade along the route from Piazza Venezia to the Colosseum, thereby visually associating himself with the Roman Imperium. While considerable excavation did take place in the Forum as a consequence of these initiatives, the Via dei Fori Imperiali remains essentially a parade ground, and is still used for that purpose by the Italian government and military. The destruction of Marforio was a product of an officially conceived moral panic about undesirable inhabitants and insanitary conditions. The earlier model of Baron Haussmann in Paris, of course, comes to mind, and it's a classic case of how power reconfigures aesthetics as a tool of exclusion. That somehow these medieval buildings, which we would probably regard as very interesting, were conveniently described as not just unsanitary, but ugly. And this is a story that has been repeated over and over, most recently at the turn of the century, of the last turn of the century, in Barcelona, where a whole medieval quarter, the last remaining one, was essentially destroyed by government fiat. Around the Via dei Fori Imperiali, especially in the Rione Monti, which is where I did my fieldwork in the Jubilee year of 2000, the drumbeat of forced eviction and massive gentrification reached its crescendo in that year. Families were forced out of a place they'd called home for 2 centuries or more to make way for wealthy and influential political and cultural actors with little interest in neighborhood identity or any kind of neighborhood activism. The Via dei Fori Imperiali continues to this day, despite calls for it to be dismantled and excavated for the still hidden antiquities beneath, to serve the Italian state as a focal point for national presentation. There is continuity of a sort here, but continuity in the story of the commodification of the past, rather than continuity with antiquity itself. Now, there's a contrast here with the Agora excavations, because the Agora excavations didn't become a place for such exuberant and militaristic preening. They have been stalwartly protected and presented as exclusively an archaeological site, a place to study, admire, and ruminate, but not at all a site for the aggrandizement of the political leadership or for patriotic displays. It's happened occasionally, but that's not been really their history. In reality, there's no need for such displays at the Agora because the site forms part of a larger visual narrative that connects not the government, or at least not any particular government, but the nation and the nation state as an abstract entity with the classical past that was always the country's basic claim to the support of the Western powers during the struggle for and the establishment and reinforcement of independent statehood. The state has created its own sites of self-display in and around Sintagma Square especially. It insists that archaeological sites should be treated with something more closely approaching religious veneration, as indeed Eliane Yaluri has suggested for the Acropolis, and some of the same aura, I think, hangs over the Agora site. It is also true, as Corelli says, that if the American school had not demolished the Vrysaki neighborhood in the 1930s, the contractors putting up polykatikias in the 1950s and 60s would have carried out the same work, with the double loss, let me add, of the recorded history of Vrysaki and access to the archaeological remains themselves. Although there might, and here you see where the nuance becomes important, there might also have been a significant social gain inasmuch as the polykatikia, unlike more ambitious high-rise constructions which are now beginning to threaten the balance of Athens, does not, as Theocharopoulou reminds us, erase social life, but in important respects enables it. So if Vrysaki had been replaced by such medium-rise buildings with their capacity to facilitate an eyes-on-the-street sociality, the community might not only have survived, but according to the dynamic documented by Theocharopoulou, flourished and expanded its collective engagement with the city as a whole. We can't know whether this actually could have happened, but I mentioned the possibility because just as we can see both positive and negative dimensions to the destruction of Vrysaki, we must also be willing to concede positive aspects to the frequently derided polykatikia architectural form, and to see both as adaptations, the first by a partly foreign-directed intellectual and political elite, the second by an indigenous class of builders seeking upward social mobility and doing it through the practice of buying up apartments, of receiving apartments in pay for the work that they did, to the emergent capitalist and neoliberal realities embodied in their most brutal form in the Greek sovereign debt crisis of around 2009. Both the Roman sventramento and the Agora excavations, however, reflect the process that I have called spatial cleansing. I model this term, of course, on ethnic cleansing and associate it with the sort of moral panic that has been used to justify the construction of similarly central, broad, tank-friendly avenues in places as far from each other as Paris, Beijing, Rome, and Bangkok. It's also associated with the use of what Italians call recinti, symbolic markers of a space as the property of the nation state, in which any unauthorized presence of individuals is treated as transgression. In Mary Douglas' classic sense, it represents taxonomy projected onto the ground. This is time that is sacred, and this is the place that represents it. In her deeply personal epilogue, Dumont herself recognizes this process when she acknowledges the gentrifying characteristics of Anastasios Halvosidis' vision. He was the main Greek agent for this process, for a refurbished neoclassical zone as parallel in some respects to what actually happened in Monte and would have happened in Marforio if it hadn't been completely destroyed. There are other hints of similarity between the Vrysaki story and other cases. At one point, for example, we hear that Halvosidis acquired a house whose owner had been reduced to desperation by a loan shark, especially as others had refused to give them a loan, quote, because of the limitations of the American zone, unquote, which I take to mean because you couldn't do anything anymore because it was going to be cleared for archaeological excavation. Now, I've documented in some detail the downward spiral to which loan sharking in Rome, often, in some cases anyway, aided and abetted by unscrupulous bank managers, adds to the pressure working against those who resist gentrification and want to remain in their homes. One wonders whether the case described by Halvosidis was unusual for the depressed Athens of the 1930s. If the parallel with Rome is even a partial guide, the steep descent into inescapable debt may have worked in favor of the excavations, especially because it was already well known that the Americans were planning to excavate, with the result, as Halvosidis' comment suggests, that the houses themselves would already be financially worthless. This was a kind of driven speculation. In fact, he noted that some of these poor devils of owners, that's his expression, could, quote, neither sell nor mortgage their properties, one possible inference being, again, the operation of unscrupulous moneylenders, although Dumont instead plausibly sees in such statements the difficulty of buying a property out of sequence against a background of wild currency fluctuation that other seasons obviously couldn't do anything about. We wouldn't in any case expect to see much information about the role of loan sharks. People are very reticent, especially if they're in debt, because anybody who is in debt is already suspected of being a bad bet for anyone else who might otherwise, possibly help out. So debtors find themselves being shunned, and it's very hard to get information. It took me a long time to learn what was going on in Rome. Now, of course, in Vrysaki, we are not dealing with gentrification, but with an officially sanctioned and approved archaeological excavation. And that means that other explanations, such as the one advanced by Dumont, are valid for this particular case. Nevertheless, we can more generally say that economic forces, abetted in some cases by deeply submerged illegal financial practices, are part of the process that has inexorably, if unevenly, closed off European city centers to the poor, who were once both its inhabitants and its service providers. So there's an important social disaster that this situation creates, with middle class and wealthy people expecting to receive services which suddenly disappear because the poor can no longer afford to stay in place. So there is Halvosidis. And one of the things that's very notable in the record of Vrysaki is one of the more, I'd say, entertaining parts of Dumont's description. She very carefully quotes a number of documents, including letters and newspaper reports. The language that erupted between the evictees and the authorities, especially Halvosidis himself, was very colorful, and it didn't save anyone from being evicted. And there's a certain sense in those documents that already those with the power to enforce the evictions and the demolitions were justifying themselves by regarding the inhabitants as somehow lesser citizens, as being dangerous, as being uncouth. And so these kinds of letters were taken as evidence, and the newspapers certainly picked up on that on that theme as well, as you can see from this statement. I mean, this is very much like something that Stefano Portelli, a young Italian anthropologist, has demonstrated for the city of Ostia, just on the outside of Rome, on the coast, where local journalists have joined in the demonization of people who are essentially squatters, but who have received absolutely no help from the state in dealing with their situations, and calling them mafiosi and trying to fix the mafioso label to them. You see something of that kind, not as extreme, but it's something like that going on. And I can tell you that you see it not only in urban situations. I've documented something very similar for the in the book Subversive Archaism for the Cretan mountain village of Zoniana, which many of you would only know from the media and probably think is an extraordinarily dangerous place. I lived there for 2.5 years. I can tell you it's not. But people sometimes wonder how I survived. And I think some of that flavor is also present in the way that Athosides then cites attacks on him and points to the uncouth language, which is clearly a sign these people did not deserve to live in such a noble place anyway. And, again, we look at what's happened in Barcelona. The same sort of arguments were being advanced, particularly as many of the people living in the low-cost houses provided by the fascist government in the 30s were people of traveler origin, Rom, Sinti, etc., and therefore it was easy for the government, without saying so directly, to play up to the racist assumptions made by the Catalan majority, and so on. I mean, we can go on with lots of examples. I saw some of this in Bangkok, where actually the attack became almost anti-archaeological, in the sense that when the community I was studying was actually evicted in toto, all of the beautiful wooden vernacular buildings dating back to the early 19th century in some cases were ruthlessly destroyed because the government wanted to remove any trace of the existence of such a community, having been very actively bad-mouthing it for 2.5 decades. They actually resisted it for 25 years. Now, Dumont points out that Athosides was also concerned, and that's a word, about the residents' eventual fate. And she argues that he showed this in advocating for their temporary exemption from property taxes in their new locations. The government was willing to make that concession, but not to provide a single place where they would all want to go. And that actually was quite reasonable, because they didn't all want to go on living together in that situation. Now, it's not my intention to call Athosides' sincerity into question. Actually, anthropologists don't do that. We have a basic principle that you can't read people's minds. The psychological inner state is inaccessible. All we can talk about is the actual rhetoric, the statements that he made, and so on. But you can see that in that political context, his comments would have certainly reinforced official desire to get those people out of the site. And I've seen this also in Thailand, where, again, there are a number of very important archaeological sites that are still inhabited. And rather than seeing this as an important and interesting synergy, the authorities want to clean out the sites of the people. And when you start treating people as dirt, which is what that implies, then clearly something has gone badly wrong. I simply want to point out Athosides' apparent insensitivity to the affective dimensions of placeness. It's part of a larger ideological pattern in which those with power seem to feel entitled to disparage and disrupt working-class people's social arrangements to the point of dismantling them altogether. Athosides certainly had his own version of placeness in mind, but it was one dictated by the state's and the archaeologists' fixation on the classical world. The world is still full of projects to create new neighborhoods dedicated to a particular poor population, but with a weak or non-existent understanding of what expectations the residents would have regarding the best possible forms of socially responsive architecture. I've seen several such cases in Bangkok, for example, and the reaction is almost always the same. Once the tie to the original community is broken, people find ways to repair or replace their social existence under new circumstances, but how far they succeed does vary enormously, and those who are at the bottom end of the economic scale usually fail. In the disputes between Adolcides and the residents, much of the argument had to do with the idea of central urban place. Until relatively recently, the central areas of most European capitals were home to vast numbers of relatively poor people, the people who were required to maintain basic services, as I hinted earlier. And for that reason, rents here in Athens, in Rome, in Bangkok, were spectacularly low. And that meant that actual home ownership was not necessarily a problem. You didn't have to own your property because the rents were low enough you could cope. And Athens really solved that problem later as Peter Allen and Ioanna Theokaropoulou again have demonstrated in relation to the practice of antiparochi, the way in which most of the polykatekias were actually constructed. But these two things, then certain things changed in tandem. Technology rendered some of the old service professions irrelevant, so we no longer need newspaper sellers because everybody looks up the news on their computers. While neoliberal investment in historic property as a high-end source of financial gain drove rents and prices up an extraordinary speed. In Rome, when I was doing my research there in 2000, over 1 year, some places increased 10 times to 10 times their value at the beginning of the year. And this was obviously being fed by all sorts of unscrupulous speculators who were feeding properties to each other in collusion and thereby forcing the prices higher and higher. Now, for the residents of Vrysaki in the 1930s, such considerations of historical value were part of their own experience, not in relation to their homes, which were about to be demolished, but through the area's status as a major archaeological site. Their lives were disrupted instead by something more akin to the sventramenti, the disembowelings in Rome, but with a twist. For whereas in Rome these developments served the egotism, the egomania of a dictator who'd taken control of an entire nation state without any real external support or interference, the Vrysaki story takes place in the context of Greece's relations with the old colonial powers and now with the United States, and the impact of that relationship on the valuation of culture. This difference invites serious reflection. First, let us consider the matter from the probable perspective of the residents. Central location is almost always of vital importance for working-class urban dwellers, and it often conflicts with the elite desire to control that space, make it symbolically significant, and exclude from it anyone whose presence might cause embarrassment, dirty people, people who don't know how to behave. I well remember the incomprehension shown by Harvard's administration when confronted by the living wage campaign that culminated in the year 2002, and I was involved in that campaign. Why, said a university spokesman, why are they so upset about their wages when they can take expensive Harvard courses for free? The fact that none of the workers could afford to live anywhere near the university apparently never occurred to our fearless leaders. Perhaps a closer parallel with Vrysaki, though, is suggested by the relocation proposed for the Pom Mahakan community that I studied in Bangkok, a community mostly composed of itinerant food vendors, and their livelihood was beginning to whittle away anyway because a lot of the bureaucrats were being pushed out to places further from the center as well. They were offered a move to land some 40 kilometers away, a piece of land where there were no infrastructural advantages. In fact, there was no school, no hospital, and the trade in food was actually controlled by a local mafia, so they wouldn't have had any kind of possibility of working there. And the whole project was totally unviable, so they turned it down, and then, of course, were represented as being obdurate. The point I want to make is that with the best will in the world, no relocation can ever begin to restore the social and professional cohesion of a neighborhood community unless appropriate services and tutelage are also provided. And in the Athens of the 1930s, such a prospect must have been unimaginable, if only because the authorities didn't even have the financial means to do it. Dumont illustrates the pressures that Athens was under even before the Asia Minor disaster, and the arrival of so many refugees, and certainly after it, when the refugees often solved the practical limitations of their allotted space in ingenious ways that reflected a great deal of creativity and a determination to preserve the spatial dimensions of social structure in their new setting, nonetheless, there was no government help. In the case of Vrysaki, the state was ill-equipped to deal with the situation, and documentation of what happened to the residents after they left is, as Dumont points out, virtually non-existent. Her hesitation about whether Vrysaki was a working-class district, although she tends to think it was, is indicative of these ambiguities. There were obviously people of quite widely differing income, and very often, of course, the authorities will use the line, well, there's some wealthy people there, so obviously they're not that badly off and they can afford to move. And I suspect that something like this was going on. But again, we don't know, because those kinds of comments didn't make it into the record, as far as I can see anyway. The exchanges with Adosides show that he was a man with a tormented conscience. I think we should give him the credit for that much. I mention this neither to evoke sympathy for him, nor to point an accusing finger at him. Discussion of his character and ethics would distract attention from the real problem, which is rather what his torments reveal about the conflicting forces of which he found himself in the vortex. In particular, we should pose the question of whether the residents stood to gain anything from the relocation. Clearly, they themselves didn't think they would. In Dumont's empathetic portrayal, Adosides comes across as a complex personality. He was secretly aware that the residents had moral right on their side, and toward the end of his life, he ruminated on the social effects of mass eviction. If I were to characterize his position on the basis of what Dumont reports, I would suggest that he was not wholly unwitting agent of a policy that ran roughshod over the lives of the residents, but that their pleas and threats had made him realize how hard relocation would be for them. In his ironically imaginary endgame, where he pictures himself as acting, quote, somewhat like Nero in starting a massive fire, he seems more concerned with the fate of the archives and archaeological finds than with the displacement of hundreds of people rendered homeless on a single night. The Nero analogy is not so fanciful. While there is nothing to suggest that Adosides was either cruelly indifferent to the sufferings of the residents or interested in personal self-aggrandizement, there really isn't anything to suggest that. We should think of his imagined scenario as one in which the crypto-colonial state, rather than the good Adosides, occupied the role of the Emperor Nero, and in which that state prioritized monuments over people. Even as the agent of the situation, he was aware of its questionable ethics. And thanks to that awareness, we are made more aware of the conflicts involved. His scenario is a dramatic, fictional tale of spatial cleansing again. Fictional in the specific idea of setting the houses on fire, which never happened as far as we know, but an accurate allegory of what was eventually to befall all the residents. The scenario also reminds us that in addition to the moral panic about working-class people in symbolically important urban areas, the state and its supporters are powerfully committed to a hierarchy of aesthetic values. That hierarchy originates in colonialism and survives today in UNESCO with its Cartesian bureaucracy and still predominantly Western-derived criteria of aesthetic excellence and historical significance. It continues, as I've argued, for the treatment of handicraft production in Crete to permeate Greek ideas about modernity. In 1930s Greece, there was certainly compelling geopolitical as well as ideological reason to sustain the presence of American and other foreign archaeologists. They were, after all, together with their Greek counterparts, heavily invested in securing the identification of modern Greek with its ancient forebears. I hardly need to point out to this audience that cultural continuity in Greece is a complex and contested reality. But, and you may be surprised to hear me say this, it is a reality. What aspects of that reality would get selected is the important issue. And it's one that's very much bound up with the cultural politics of the Cold War and the colonial pressures that preceded it. Let us simply recall that a favored form of ideological indoctrination was to force alleged communist prisoners in Makronisi to build, rebuild, and build again replicas of ancient Greek temples, apparently with the blessing of the camp clergy, despite their well-known suspicion of paganism. So you see here the prisoners with an ancient temple they've just constructed, and then in the photo on the right, you actually see the blessing or the sermon being pronounced by the camp priest. And here you have the contradictions of Elas Elinon Christianon in perhaps its starkest form, and that was very much part of the Cold War. But I also want to point out that this use of a building technique as a form of indoctrination really gives new meaning to that wonderful phrase that was invented, I think, by a British architect at the beginning of the 20th century, that architecture is the clothing of the body politic. So, the idea here was that if the Greeks as a nation would continue to clothe themselves in this way repeatedly, they would strip themselves of all this foreign dogma called communism and become like good Greeks as described by 19th century classical scholarship, Winkelmann et al. And so this brings us to the neoclassical style, because that style is about displaying that identity. But remarkably, it doesn't stop in Germany and Greece. And the British, of course, used it extensively, always as a sign of authority. These days, banks continue to use neoclassical facades and ornamental elements, and we find it, as you'll see in a moment, in a surprising array of countries. 19th century domestic architecture often sported classical motifs and ornaments as well, engaging a display of fealty to the neoclassical ideal that paid a disproportionate attention to the exterior appearance of the house. It's no coincidence that this occurred with the achievement of independence, and especially after Athens became the national capital. What Dumont does not specify is how the interiors often remain close to their Balkan precursors and Balkan interiors that continued to be built in the old way, and with interior decoration that was more connected to Orthodox Christianity, for example, the iconostasio, the way that it was placed and so forth, than to the neoclassical mode. Houses became appropriately the physical embodiment of the adage ta eniko mi endimo, and that is what actually led me to develop the concept of cultural intimacy, because I became very aware of that this is a country, you find this in every country to some extent, but as a result of Greece's peculiar history, it's a country where you become immediately aware of huge tension between self-display and self-knowledge, or self-representation, if you will. So, Greek vernacular architecture had long expressed the importance of secrecy between unrelated households, for example, walls that made it difficult to peer into your neighbor's house. And Athenian houses, increased window size notwithstanding, were no exception. At a time when the purist language, katharevasa, often served as a form of display to foreign observers, trying to convince them we are really ancient Greeks, and often with French and German elements that, for example, in the syntax, the language provided a very similar sense of that tension between self-display and self-knowledge. And in fact, just one very obvious example, in demotic, when we use the relative pronoun, we say pou, but if we're writing a little more formally, and certainly this was done in katharevasa, you would use o opius and tu opiu, which of course is nothing other than our old friends from French classroom, lequel, duquel. And these traces remain very present, and certain more conservative scholars, such as the late Angelos Zelivorias, I was just told, used to scoff at what he called pupudismos. But in any case, they are useful sometimes, these phrases, I won't deny that, but it's important to see that the language had this double identity built into it in the same way as we see in the architecture. Now, there are parallels between all of these, what I call dicemic contrasts in language, architecture, music, and much else. But the architecture serves as a very visible reminder of the extent to which Greece was made to dance to the tune of Western Europe's expectations. These same devices all served as instruments whereby a rising middle class could associate itself with the ideals of European civilization. That image is still compelling, as one can see from this hairdressing salon. I hope I'm doing this the right way for once. For some reason, we've got it in the wrong place. I'm going to have to backtrack for a moment. No, I don't have it, but we'll see it later. There's a hairdressing salon, and you'll see exactly what I mean. I won't spoil the show, because we're going to see at the very end of my talk a very quick set of neoclassical motifs, just to make the point of what this is doing. As bourgeois Athenians began to move into grander dwellings, and the new arrivals took over the polykatikias, the remnants of these early attempts to recapture classical grandeur for domestic dwelling fell into disrepair. Their antisteria collectibles for the nostalgic, and their facades a backdrop for casual tourist photography in search of more grandiose monuments. We risk forgetting the pain of eviction that made the marvels of the Agora accessible to us today. We risk forgetting that the building of those simple neoclassical houses sprang from the same civilizational imperative as the excavations that then displaced them. And we risk forgetting that archaeology, as Kurelis so well expressed it, inflicts deep wounds on the social as well as on the physical landscape, and, let me add, erases memories of alternative pasts. Athens, to be sure, is a way of reconstituting its sociality, although, as I've said, the Airbnb phenomenon will severely test that resilience. Moreover, the rich research that leads to productions like Vrysaki reminds us that Athenian sociality has a long history. This has been a remarkably sociable city for a very long time. As we now wonder whether it will survive in the neoliberal age, it may be salutary to recall that, like early anthropologists recording the cultural practices their inquisitive and acquisitive colonialism was already destroying, archaeologists, many of them from this very institution, both demanded the destruction and yet also created a record that Sylvie Dumont has now concretized for posterity. One could, of course, object that archaeologists were doing no more than what their training demanded, recording what they destroyed. One could also complained that their actions were like the imperial nostalgia, or what I call bureaucratic nostalgia, whereby the powerful seek to seem respectful of the social realities they've destroyed. And here we see the community where I was working in Bangkok before it was destroyed, and that is what you saw afterwards. And all over this, there are little signs that say, here was a street of charcoal burners, here was a street of gold smelters. And I call this bureaucratic nostalgia because a Mexican-American anthropologist, Renato Rosaldo, pointed out that when the British conquered parts of Africa, they would build museums to cultures they'd completely destroyed. He called that imperial nostalgia, and it seemed like a good model for talking about what the bureaucrats are doing here. And some of that has certainly happened in Athens, although I have to say, nothing like on the scale you see it in Bangkok. You can hardly go anywhere in Bangkok without seeing these little signs. Even in a high-rise mall, you will find little signs that say, way down below, there was once a community, and it describes the community in glowing, very romantic terms that probably also don't bear much resemblance to reality. And now we'll just do a quick gallop. This is the Roulandris Museum on Eratosthenes before it was restored. And I found this sign really quite interesting, because the idea of the restoration of a building that is to be preserved itself plays with notions of time. It tells you a great deal about the concept of time that animates the whole conservation enterprise. There it is, just to make the point as strongly as I can. And this is what it looks like now. Now, I think it's quite beautiful, and it's a wonderful museum. But the interesting thing here is that obviously the authorities thought, well, for want of a classical building, the whole area is full of polykatikias, let's make this a glorious reminder of how the foundation of the Greek state was linked to the classical ideal, and so that's what they did. These are pictures from Vrysaki, just very quickly. Interestingly enough, Dumont does not say very much about social dynamics. It's very clear from the pictures, though, that the public spaces were very much occupied by men, and that women tended to stay out of sight or be seen on balconies, safely removed, very much in a way that anthropologists describe life in villages in Greece. Obviously, this is no longer, at least not in this form, true of Athens, but it's an interesting testimony to the way that Dumont really collected a remarkable set of pictures together, that you can actually see that social dynamic to some extent. That's a very typical street scene, for example. And of course, the archaeological service itself, Schneemann's old house, it's moved out of there since there, but this is an example of, again, the Germans building classical buildings in the heart of Athens that were often imitations of their own neoclassical buildings, as they claimed to be the place to which humanity and humanities and letters had migrated, the University of Athens. And next door, right, the Anatheum. But it permeates into all sorts of little things. So here's a, close the door carefully, always make sure the door is closed. Katharavosa, or essentially classical Greek, functions quite well because it's an economical language. And so this has been, it's an old sign, but you still see quite modern looking signs. These tendrils of the old neoclassical ideology are still with us in certain ways. This, of course, is mostly restored 19th century architecture. But then, of course, the attempts at a vernacular level to imitate it. And here we come to the one I promised you in Crete. And this one is particularly revealing because if we look at the detail, first of all, up top, you can see that not only does it say comotirio, which is a fairly formal word, but underneath it has it in French, coiffure. So we are making a claim on both classical and European identity. And in case you have any doubts at all, we've got a little bust in the bottom right-hand corner just to make sure that there are no misunderstandings. And I'm going to close with some unexpected ones. I don't know if anyone can guess where this one is from or this one. Any takers? They're both from the same city. And those of you who know me might be able to guess, it's Bangkok. And I want to make the point that, that the previous one was a hotel and this one is a big mall, that these neoclassical signs seem to flourish at the point where the management of money and the management of power and foreign influence come together. So I close with the sentence, with the pictures, and I just want to make one more remark, and I've already gone on for quite a long time. What I've sought to sketch tonight is the parts of what would be a more nuanced interpretation than either saying, well, of course, Vrysaki had to go. It was a sore, and I saw it, and it was a mess, and anyway, it was getting in the way of an important excavation, versus what a terrible thing these people did. I'm trying to fight for that militant middle space when I say, let's recognize that it's very obvious that Athasides had real ethical concerns about what he was doing. It doesn't mean we have to approve, and I certainly don't, but that's a personal choice, and I think that these kinds of situations always face us with the difficulty of taking a nuanced position where there's an ethical conflict involved. Clearly, the archaeologists of the time thought they were rescuing a Thucydidean procession for all time from complete erasure. If we're respectful of other cultures and societies, which is what anthropologists always try to claim they do, we should also respect their attempts to work within a zeitgeist that was largely determined by the dynamics of a dishonest global regime and by a highly selective understanding of Hellenism. We should also recognize that even today, if a new Agora were to appear somehow, the temptation to sequestrate, demolish, and eradicate might well reappear, albeit, one hopes, with more concern for the eventual fate of those evicted and suitable provision for their social and psychological well-being. Or we might try for a hybrid solution, such as that once proposed for the Pammaha community in Bangkok, whereby the residents would have become guardians of the historic site on which they lived and their social existence intact and even flourishing. And unfortunately, that vision was destroyed by political machinations, which again leads me to say it's very easy to say government was evil, but there was actually one governor of Bangkok, essentially the mayor of Bangkok, who had arrived at a good solution, which would have allowed the residents to stay on the site as guardians of the site and responsible for its upkeep, but that was then destroyed by his enemies who were out to get him on other things. Such creative openness is the balancing act required by a genuine middle ground. Our presence tonight is testimony that scholarship can engage what emerge retrospectively as its own trespasses, and that scholars can accept their collective responsibility for past decisions they might or might not regret today, and probably have very mixed feelings about in any case. We must critically interpret those decisions in the light of the context in which they occurred, and recognize that certain ethical dilemmas never admit of a clear, one-sided resolution. I might add parenthetically, those of us who wrestle with the bureaucracy of ethics committees are very aware that those committees are trying to impose on ethics something that doesn't belong there, namely predictability. In an increasingly polarized world, sadly becoming just a little bit more so, I think, we can still be deeply critical and empathetically understanding at one and the same time. As an anthropologist, I can ask for nothing less. But I have tried your patience for long enough, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you. Stay up here.
Are you willing to take questions?
I'll take questions, but I may need you to help me because I don't hear very well. So.
I'll go over to
Excellent.
the computer here and then.
Yes, I think so. Yeah. Should I come and sit there as well, or? It's easier for me if I can see the person. Okay, when we do that.
Well, first, let me thank you for a really inspiring lecture, and that took us around the world, but with similar issues and questions. And could I open the floor to people in the audience who might have a question? And we also have an opportunity for those online to ask. I think we have Jessica here.
I have a request to make. I am quite hard of hearing, and so if you would please speak, it's not so much a matter of speaking loud, but speaking slowly. It may be my slow brain. I'm not sure which part of me is at fault here, but anyway, if you wouldn't mind speaking very slowly and clearly, that would be a tremendous advantage. Thank you. And I'd like to be able to see your face. I lip read a bit.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. I'm over here. Okay. Thank you very much for that important work. I was wondering if you could speak to what degree you see these conversations continuing today in terms of the acquisition of land and destruction of buildings by archaeologists in the present day.
Of course, many good examples where the people who've been evicted have been compensated, and by compensated I don't necessarily mean financially. I think the real problem is it used to be thought that money would do it. Money doesn't. These are people who've been living with very low expectations of income for a very long time. What they want is some way either of maintaining their social relations or an improvement in their lifestyle such that they will be able to stay in touch with the people who are important to them. Human beings are social animals, basically, and I think that in the very few cases I've come across where the effort has been made, first of all, to involve the residents in the archaeological project itself, which gives, so for example, the Vrysaki project that Nixon and others have talked about and have worked on, but there are a number of other such projects where the residents themselves have an active interest. They then start to feel that there's something in it for them. And I'm not saying then, that's fine and then we don't have to worry about what follows. I think all of this should be provided. If you're destroying somebody's way of life, you have a moral obligation to replace it with something they recognize as equivalent. And that means talking to them, and it means also treating them as your intellectual equals. One problem that I think, if I may put it this way, in the old days, I think it's no longer an issue, but in the past, anthropologists had a real problem with archaeologists who acted as if it was obvious that the archaeology was more important. And thankfully, that is no longer the case. I think in most, certainly places that most of us are familiar with, but still a lot of the time the provisions for reconstructing sociality have not been adequate, and I think this is something that requires urgent attention still. Thank you, it's an important question.
Thank you so much.
Christos, I think there's a question in the back.
It's very daunting looking out over this large audience, this huge room. So, but I'm
so sorry, I don't have a question, but just as a participant, I'm very surprised that in the United States, archaeology, anthropology, physical anthropology, linguistics are all together, and yet I did not see any influence of anthropology today in your talk, to the archaeologists of that time. And my second comment is your lecture pressures us to have interdisciplinary studies, especially not in theoretical as much in other science. If our PhDs, if our medical schools or archaeology schools do not integrate other disciplines, we cannot have the knowledge that you have. I don't know if it was understood in what I said.
I'm having trouble hearing you. Can you speak a bit louder, actually, in this case? Yeah, it's not coming across very well.
I don't want to take more of your time.
It sounded like an interesting issue.
That we need interdisciplinary studies at the higher level in order to have archaeologists or anthropologists or MDs doing the right job, the right way. If you have a doctor that doesn't know anthropology, how can he practice medicine the correct way in Southern America, in Africa? The same thing if archaeology does not have interdisciplinary attitude in doing its job, how can they understand how they should have destroyed the area to do what they did and how to rebuild it, how to enter with the Greek government in helping them. We are at the beginning of interdisciplinary understanding for the problems of mankind. I'm sorry, that's what that's what I have been thinking while you were presenting this wonderful
Well, thank you. No, I think,
lecture.
I think we can take that question. It's an important issue. Interdisciplinarity, of course, is very difficult. And as I always say to my students, interdisciplinarity only works if you have disciplines. So, people need to be trained in their discipline, but they also need to be sensitive, as I think you're pointing out, to what happens in related fields. And after all, archaeologists, a lot of the time, are dealing with living people. And often, as you see in a lot of the work that's been done recently, Yannis Kapinakis is a good example, you work with people who actually have a lively understanding of what they're finding around them. It's not the same as the academic understanding, but the conversation between the two would be facilitated if the archaeologists, and I think this is certainly consistent with what you're saying, would just discuss it with some anthropologists who'd worked in the neighborhood, or read some of what anthropologists have written about the local societies. And one problem that arises here is that there's often an assumption by local scholars, especially outside of anthropology, well, we are from this country, so we know what these people are, and our fellow countrymen and women, we know what they are, and there's nothing to study, which of course is totally wrong, because local communities vary enormously, and therefore the sort of collaboration that you're pointing to, I think, is essential, and it will make for better archaeology. My undergraduate degree was actually in archaeology. Now, you may regard me as a renegade, and that's as it may be, but the thing is that my archaeology has also influenced my understanding of anthropology. A lot of anthropologists wrote as if what they were looking at had no past. That to me makes no sense, and it couldn't make sense to anyone who had some kind of training in the historical disciplines, including archaeology. So yes to interdisciplinarity, yes to respect for the local versions of the disciplines, because they often know things that the imported scholars don't know. Yes to respect for local understandings of sites, and yes, above all, to open-mindedness of any kind. I mean, I think really, when I talk here about the middle ground, that's what I'm arguing for. We are seeing now in an increasingly politically and ideologically and culturally polarized world, people act as if it's impossible to have a conversation. That is so antithetical to what we believe as academics that our own professions are now at stake. And so I think this kind of conversation across those disciplinary lines is absolutely essential.
We will not have that if in academia we don't take care of the curriculum in a different way. What I suggest is that you allow anthropologists to enter medical schools, even if they don't score very well in mathematics or so. Anyway, I was thinking mostly as an academic person that the hope we're having is to have more integrated graduate programs. And I don't see, for example, even in archaeology or in this school here, for example, there is a need for genetic studies or whatever in the bones, etc., that they find, and there is nothing from biological science that integrate into archaeology or anyway. This is
that's not. Excuse me for interrupting.
This is my story.
Let me just say, first of all, it's not entirely true, because certainly
no,
people who do paleosteology, for example, have to know biology. But social anthropologists will also caution against the risk which often arises when biological anthropology is introduced, for example, of conflating culture with race, which is one of the curses of our time.
Right.
And that is certainly something to which a collaboration should point.
Well, let's say Harlem in New York and the construction there and the buildings and archaeology there. Anyway.
Well, thank you very much for raising these issues. Do we have other questions from the floor? Yes, we do. Oh, yeah, there are two, right? Michael, and then, yeah.
Oh, thank you for this talk. I was wondering if you had some more examples of success stories where the people were involved in the archaeological site or in whatever that their neighborhood was being replaced by. If you could talk more about those and how they succeeded.
There are very few success stories, unfortunately, and part of the problem has always been funding, because if you're looking for funding for your archaeological excavation, there's not going to be too much money left over for trying to help the people who are being displaced. And This obviously requires coordination at more or less a government level, I think, where you can say to the government, look, you have funded us to do this one thing, but you now have to put more money into the restitution of certain rights to the inhabitants who are being displaced. There have been a few cases, and I honestly can't recall offhand any specific ones, and I think that tells you something, because it's something I'm very interested in. What I see most of the time is that at some point a government decides that an excavation should go forward, and that's possibly, as in this case, I think, probably because, a good case was made for the importance of the site. And doesn't then, because Minister of Culture doesn't talk to the Minister of Social Security. This is a problem that can only really be addressed thoroughly, I think, at that sort of level. But if archaeologists would make themselves ambassadors for local communities to talk to the authorities in ways that might make that happen, I think some results could be obtained. But I have to tell you, I really can't think offhand of any really thoroughly successful cases. Maybe a few examples from the Middle East, but there, of course, other kinds of dislocations have intervened, and so the record is very thin. And I think the reasons for that are clear. And it's not a question of blaming archaeology. In fact, that's what I want to avoid doing. It's a question of how far have we gone in thinking about the sort of collaboration we would need to have with the government bureaucracy. And governments are very suspicious of anthropologists, because anthropologists have a nasty habit of speaking truth to power, and this creates other kinds of problems. But I think, that in a situation where, for example, I don't know, if for instance, a site were discovered in a Cretan village, and the government of Greece came to me and said, you know about the social structure of these people, what sort of effect is this going to have? I'm not a prophet, but I can roughly predict some of the reactions and some of the dislocations that would occur socially, and that's something that perhaps one could try to push for. But again, I don't know of many cases where it's happened.
Thank you. And I think, Christos, there's a question. Yes. Raise your hand really high. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I was wondering if you find any parallels with the Vrysaki story to the nowadays climate activists from urban areas to rural areas.
I didn't hear that. Sorry.
Yeah. Can you just repeat the first part of that really slowly?
If you find any parallels to the Vrysaki story with the whole conversation we're having nowadays for climate change and environment from people who live in more urban areas or rural, to the rural areas. I'm not...
Interpret
yes,
the
I'm
question.
sorry, because my hearing, and you're sitting in the dark, so I can't see your face, which makes
tough,
it much harder.
But I think you're wanting to understand if there's a relationship in the kind of kind of crypto-colonialism that involved Vrysaki culturally with now situations that are involving climate change.
Oh, well,
Yes.
that's actually a very important question. Thank you. And I'm sorry I didn't, again, it's difficult. When you sit in the dark, it's very hard for me to lip read. Yes, I mean, there are obvious connections between, first of all, the global south and the global north, right? What I would say about crypto-colonialism is that because it is the most dishonest form of colonialism, it claims not to exist, right? Greece was never a colony of the West. The only bourgeoisie we ever suffered was under the Turks. The Thais say we were never colonized. The Thais ended up having to pay enormous amounts of tax to the British and the French. They had very disadvantageous trading relations. British and French people had they were under the jurisdiction of their own governments even when they were living on Siamese territory as it was in the 19th century. And when Siam turned into a more mono-ethnic nation state and called itself Thailand, the land of the Thais, that dependency became even more invisible. It was always disguised with, we have a king, we have all of this panoply that shows that we're a vibrant, independent nation. And this has also been a cover, I think, for various kinds of climatically irresponsible actions. So, for example, building styles that are more about impressing visiting dignitaries with the civilizational achievements of the Siamese, of the Thai, than with providing an ecologically efficient alternative to what's there. In fact, those old houses that were destroyed in Pom Mahakan had natural ventilation that was much more effective than the very damaging and extremely uncomfortable air conditioning that Thais use in their modern buildings. And people actually talked about that. They also talked about how these local communities had identified a number of plant species that were becoming extinct, and they were cultivating them there in ways that also provided some kind of resistance to very small incremental local climatic changes. The government at one point wanted to build a boardwalk along the side of the Chao Phraya River, and thank goodness the Association of Siamese Architects, which is a somewhat left-leaning body, I suspect, protested very noisily, and quite unusually for a country that's essentially run covertly by a bunch of generals. The project was abandoned, and I think the reason for that was that the architects were able to say, look, if you build this boardwalk, the average temperature in Bangkok, which is already an extraordinarily hot place, will rise by 2 to 3 degrees centigrade, which already happened in the 1950s when the then governor of Bangkok had all the canals, or not all, but most of the canals filled in with concrete to make roads and created all the traffic jams and everything else. So yes, I think that, that there is a place for thinking about also about what the archaeological excavations can tell us about the long-term climatic changes. But you need to have people there who are in a position to make that interpretation. And I'm glad you raised that, because I think that is one of the pressing issues of our time. And again, it's one of those places where, you know, in reference to the previous questioner, some sort of interdisciplinary communication is absolutely necessary and hasn't been happening enough. And what we need in this case is people who are willing to understand that even though some social arrangements are not always ecologically 100% the best that you could imagine, people have to live in the space, and that infrastructure includes social relations. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Other questions here on the floor? Yes, we do have, here, we'll take this one, and then perhaps we'll...
Someone in the light. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for this talk. I feel privileged to have attended tonight. My question is a little bit broader. So in academia, we identified colonialism, we identified crypto-colonialism, we rushed to decolonize everything, and then we realized we are probably whitewashing everything. Where do we go from here?
Sorry, it's a very good question to ask where we go from here. Speaking, if I may now, as both an outsider and as a Greek citizen, I'm very concerned for this country, because I see that business interests, and this is something that is magnified many times over in the United States, are increasingly making decisions that defy what the science tells them. I'm not anti-science, even though I am very much against scientism, the imitation of science. And I think that recognizing that countries still live in the shadow of a relationship of dependency is a first step towards saying, what is the damage that that dependency does? So
One could argue that crypto-colonialism is no longer a big issue for Greece because it's been identified. We see it more as something that was true from the middle of or actually from the foundation of the Greek state up to, let's say, the fall of the junta in 1974. It certainly isn't as evident in everyday life because in a way it has been displaced by something equally hegemonic, which is the neoliberal ideology. And until we can find effective ways to say and convince the world, the people who vote in elections, that voting for people who represent the power of money against people who have their interests at heart but realize that having those interests at heart is also going to mean they're not going to get all the consumer goods, they're not going to have all the creature comforts they've been accustomed to, because the world is becoming overheated and we need to do something. That's going to be the big challenge. So where we go from here, we mobilize. I mean, I think it's becoming urgently apparent, not particularly in this country. In fact, Greece has set a very good example to the rest of the world in the number of independent movements that have sprung up that, for example, deal with the lack of medicines. You know, these clinical arrangements that have been ad hoc arrangements being put together by volunteers who deal with climatic changes by trying to change the food supply chain and the way it works, who deal with questions of economic dependence by asking whether, in fact, the use of the euro is the most wise solution. Now, we're not going to be able to solve all of those problems immediately, but it does seem to me that archaeology can also speak very usefully to these issues by showing the longue durée of this constant pattern of hegemonic subjection. That it's not that Greece is more victimized than other countries, much as some Greeks like to think so, but the world, including the hegemonic powers themselves, are victimized by not knowing what those structures are doing to them. And I think, if I may say so, and I don't mind declaring my own political position, I think we've just seen that in the American elections. And it's a scary perspective, but I think that stories, I mean, one of the values I see in the Vrysaki archive, the work that has been done to put that book together, and this is, I think, perhaps for me the most impressive part of it, is we can see the moral dilemmas that arise, and that ought to teach us not to look for quick fix solutions, but always to try to get as many of those people who are going to be affected involved in making the decisions that will affect them. And that, of course, also means that we recognize that long history of, yes, Ottoman domination, but then something that became a cultural straitjacket, which is crypto-colonialism, and the way that crypto-colonialism was succeeded by an economic ideology that reproduces some of the same patterns, so that there is still an excessive valuation of Western culture. And let me tell you, I mean, I got into an argument once with an economist at my own university because I commented that the undergraduate social studies curriculum only had books to read by Western thinkers. And he said, well, are there any others? Right? I mean, that is the same set of attitudes. We have to fight that. And that's partly why I see my understanding of anthropology as always inherently political. But rather than taking sides, I want to try to get people to appreciate complexity. All human beings can understand nuance. Politicians act as if they couldn't. And once people wake up to the fact that they're being condescended into in that way, maybe we'll get some change. That's what I hope for.
Yeah. I join you. I would just.
I was going to say I didn't mean to make a political speech, but probably subconsciously I did.
Maybe we were ready for one. I would like to just before I thank Michael Herzfeld, I would like to also recognize the person who has been mentioned repeatedly in his lecture, which is the curator of the Vrysaki exhibition, Sylvie Dumont. So, Sylvie, you are a lone person in the balcony, but to you we owe a very great deal. And so, thank you for an excellent exhibition.
And thank you, Michael, for this.
I don't know if I would have said so many nice things about you if I'd known you were up there.
I just want to say thank you for putting Vrysaki on the international map. And my work was archival. I mean, I know I haven't covered all the sociology and ethnology of the neighborhood, but there was no information about that except the catalog that we had, which is very precious. And anyway, I did what I could, and you make very nice help to me. I remember when I became a minister, and I owe you that. And I want to thank everybody, and thank you for saying that Vrysaki is now there for prosperity. I'm glad that it's now international. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you. And perhaps with those words, let's all go down and share a glass of wine together and continue the conversation. Thanks so much.